Good evening, everybody. It's so great to see you tonight. I'm actually in a different location, as you can tell by my background. I'm broadcasting tonight from the Poconos in Pennsylvania. It's beautiful out here. America at a Crossroads is a joint venture of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. And our leadership is comprised of me and David Lehrer, whom you see on the screen, Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. We're excited to bring you tonight's program, despite the fact that it's a little bit of a depressing subject. And I'm very happy to be able to welcome two very dear old friends, both Deborah Lipstadt, my teacher and friend, and my own rabbi and longtime friend, Rabbi Ed Feinstein from Valley Beth Shalom in Encino, to talk about the new wave of anti-Semitism that we're all experiencing and reading about. Some of you may have seen in the email that David sent yesterday, a wonderful article in the forward. We're going to put it in. We're going to put a link to it in the chat so that you can, if you haven't read it yet, you can read it and you can see the huge success of this America at a Crossroads series. Next week, Michael Steele, who is the former chairman of the National Republican Party and renowned commentator, conservative commentator, Bill Kristol, will be joining us to talk about Wither the GOP. And when you do ask questions tonight in the Q&A, be sure to put where they're from. Our speakers really like hearing where the people who pose questions live so that they can just feel like they are more connected to you. And with that, let me introduce my dear friend, David Lehrer, who will introduce our speakers tonight. And thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, Janice. I join you in welcoming everyone to America at a Crossroads. It's a pleasure to introduce an old friend, one whom I first met 40 years ago. She was then a young visiting professor beginning research on the insidious phenomenon of Holocaust denial. The major purveyors of that brand of hate were headquartered here in Southern California, and I monitored their activities for the Anti-Defamation League. Since those early days, Deborah Lipstadt has gone on to become a world-renowned authority on the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, Jewish history, and is widely respected as a fighter for what is right. She is the Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory University. But for Carl Bernstein, one of our guests last year, she is our only speaker to have been the central subject of a feature film, Denial. It is about her role in the 6-year libel trial brought against her by British Holocaust denier and right-wing extremist David Irving. She resoundingly won the case. This week, The Forward, a national Jewish newspaper, in an article that Janice just described, talked about our guests as some of the world's, quote, most prominent public speakers. Deborah is certainly among them. We've invited Rabbi Ed Feinstein of Valley Beth Shalom Synagogue in Encino, California, to interview Deborah. Ed is a scholar, author of several books, a widely engaged lecturer, and the spiritual leader of one of the nation's largest synagogues in the conservative movement. He has served as a moderator with us before in the pre-COVID era. It should be a fascinating discussion on a topic that unfortunately makes new headlines virtually every day. Ed?
Good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us. And good evening, Professor Lipstadt. It's always a pleasure to spend time together.
Thank you, Rabbi Feinstein.
I certainly appreciate your insights into these issues, but I have to let the audience know that outside of the field of anti-Semitism and Holocaust studies, Professor Lipstadt is one of the most insightful interpreters of the Jewish experience as a whole. And I hope everyone has a chance one day to learn with her, as I have so many times. Deborah, it would appear to me that the American Jewish community has caught a shiver of vulnerability. Certainly a theme that's common in Jewish history, but something that this generation of American Jews never thought they would have to encounter. We booked this conversation some months ago, but since the recent battle in the Middle East, it has gotten particularly acute. It seems to so many people that anti-Semitism has come out of the shadows and become part of the mainstream of American culture. So let's begin with the most general question. How alarmed should we be?
You know, the definition of a Jewish telegram: start worrying, details follow. So tonight, the details, you know. I'm concerned. I'm worried. And many people on this seminar tonight know me. I've never been an Oidgewalter. You know, that's the Yiddish equivalent of Chicken Little, dear me, the sky is falling. I think too often in Jewish life, we try to rouse Jewish identity and strengthen Jewish identity through fear, through the oys and not the joys. But some of the things I've seen have given me pause. I just came back from London. I was in London where I had a quarantine for 5 days and take, I don't know, 4 frontal assaults on my nasal passages. But I had a chance to meet and talk with a lot of people who came and visited me in the garden where I was, in the house where I was staying. And it was right after, I arrived right after Shavuot, where on the night of Shavuot, people were discussing, not everyone, but enough people that I heard it from different sources. Was it safe to walk to shul? Should they walk on the main street, the high street? Should they go on back roads? I met with a couple of high school students who had been told specifically by their Jewish day schools not to wear their uniforms with the identifying insignia in the street, but to wait till they get to school to put on their blazers or their jackets or their jumpers, their sweaters. That's London. That's London. That's North London. You know, that's a vibrant Jewish life. We saw some things here in America that were very disturbing, but none of it is really a surprise. I've been watching this phenomenon probably since the last war in Gaza, since 2014. And it's been growing and it's been developing. I'm not saying, oh my God, it's all over, or this is 1939. I don't think it is. I think things are very different. But in your question, you said something very, very astute and accurate, not surprisingly, accurate. And that is that people, the restraints some people felt on saying certain things if they haven't disappeared, they've diminished. People feel freer to say certain things that they didn't say before.
You've written and you've said that this is the perfect storm, that we see an anti-Semitism growing on the far right, an anti-Semitism growing on the far left, and an Islamist anti-Semitism growing about us. The anti-Semitism on the far right doesn't seem to surprise Jews. That's something we have a historical experience with. The conspiracy theory of replacement theory, Jews will not replace us, the tiki torches and the violence of that movement, something that surprises, I think shocks us, but the phenomenon doesn't surprise us. I think it's the anti-Semitism on the left, particularly among progressives who we thought were our allies in protecting civil rights. The anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism, for example, of some of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the phenomenon on college campuses. So let's talk about that. Tell us, where does that come from? What is the nature of this intersectionality that seems to have condemned Jews and condemned Zionism?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that some of your listeners, and often when I talk about it coming from both sides, get into which is worse. And which is worse, I can almost imagine Shalom Aleichem saying, would you rather die of cholera or dysentery? You know, both are bad. Or would you rather have cholera or dysentery? Both are bad. Both are disturbing. And I think the minute people say, if I sometimes write an article pointing at anti-Semitism on the right, Marjorie Green Taylor and her, Jewish space lasers, etc. I got the button, by the way, I got the pin, which I wear with great pride. I should have worn it tonight. It says Mazel Tov, T-O-U-G-H. There's also a hat. I have to get a hat. Someone can send me a hat like that. But which is worse is a useless enterprise. Usually when people say, when I write about the right, people will say, people on the right will say to me, but the left is worse. When I write about something on the left, they'll say, but the right is worse. Usually when you're saying which is worse, or you get into that debate, you're usually trying to camouflage, not deal forthrightly with the anti-Semitism that's right next to you. So I'm not equating the two. I'm not saying they're equal, but they're both disturbing, A. B, I don't think we should be so surprised. You know, the whole concept of Zionism as racism comes out of the Soviet Union. You know, one of the few things left of after the collapse of the Soviet Union was the anti-Semitism that it had so widely engendered. I mean, I'm talking to an organization based in LA, which was so prominent, and your synagogue as well, Ed, in the fight for Soviet Jewry, which is a fight on the left. But you're right. We're much more used to seeing anti-Semitism on the right. And let me talk about replacement, and then I'm going to talk about the left. The replacement there, because I think it deserves a little more explication. And by the way, you referenced Charlottesville and the Jews will not replace us and the tiki torches. There's going to be a civil suit in the Charlottesville case. In fact, I think the lead attorney, Roberta Kaplan, has been on this program. And I'm one of the expert witnesses on the anti-Semitism that was and the pro-Nazism and the Nazi ideology and rhetoric that was so present in the march. There it's the theory goes, of course, that these people, meaning Black people, brown people, Muslims, whatever, these people, speaking putting myself in the skin very momentarily of a white supremacist, white nationalist, they're not talented enough, they're not capable enough to be making all these gains. There has to be someone behind them. They're the puppets. There has to be a puppeteer. And who is smart enough, wealthy enough, powerful enough, conniving enough to be that puppeteer, to be using these people for their own advantage? The Jew. So that's what we see. So when they say Jews will not replace us, it's that we Jews are using, are manipulating other minorities to destroy Western Christian culture. That's the right. What's about the left? And it's not everyone on the left, just like it's not everyone on the right, but there are pockets there. As I said a moment ago, I came from London, where the Labour Party for the 3, 4, 5 years under Corbyn was a hotbed of anti-Semitism, not just criticism of Israel and not just hostility to Israel, but pure anti-Semitism. What you see on the left is something a little different than what you see on the right. On the right, they say, Jews are not white, they're other, and they're manipulating people of minorities to get their own power. On the left, the anti-Semitism that comes from the left, you see something different. You see people saying, well, Jews are white, which of course ignores all those Jews who are not white or of color, whatever term to use. And Jews are privileged, which of course ignores all Jews who are not privileged. And many, as you well know, many Jews who are not privileged, certainly financially privileged. But Jews are white, Jews are privileged, Jews have the option of passing for white, again, ignoring Jews of color. Therefore, they can't be victims of discrimination. And says the person who espouses this on the far left, and I called the second part the Miss Piggy defense. Moi? Me? I am a heartfelt person of the left. I could never be guilty of discrimination. I could never be guilty of assault. So if you, the Jew, can't be a victim, and I, the person of the left, couldn't possibly be a purveyor of hatred, then you must be making this up. Then this all must be a false front. And I want to again say it's not everyone, just like on the right, it's not everyone. Certainly on the right, we've seen far more violence and death than we've seen on the left, though some things have changed a little bit recently. But it's there. And I think if people take away anything from this evening, it's that it's very easy to criticize people on the other side of the political transom. We're all good at that. We know how to criticize, if you're on the left, how to criticize someone on the right and vice versa. But the hard thing is to criticize one of your mishpacha, one of members of your family, someone with whose views you share on so many other things, and say that's wrong. And I think that's where we have the most leverage. And that's why it's so important.
Let's pursue this just a little farther. One of the places where both anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and we'll talk about that distinction in just a moment. But one of the places where it's the most articulated is on college campuses. I mean, I would ask you, you teach at Emory, if a kid were to stand up in a class in social science or humanities and declare their advocacy for the state of Israel, what would happen to them on the Emory campus? And within academic circles, on college campuses, where did that come from? I mean, Jews are so represented in that world. Where did that come from?
It's been brewing for a long time. I think a kid on the Emory campus would be in a better position than a kid on some of the other campuses, certainly some of the campuses in California. But it's been brewing for a long time. Look, campuses are places which naturally root for the underdog. Campuses are places where you look for those who have been ignored, those who have been written out of history. I'm talking to you from Atlanta, from the South. If you looked at a history of the South written even 40 years ago, much less 100 years ago, it would have been this history of white Southern men. Maybe a few years later would be white Southern men and women. Today, anybody who didn't write about, if you're writing about the period of slavery, about the slave experience, who didn't write about the African-American experience, that would be seen as an incomplete history. Things do change. And on campuses often push that. They say, what group has been ignored? What group hasn't been given its rightful due? That's a natural inclination of a university to look in, certainly an American university. And for many, many years, we have seen this increasing sympathy, and I'm not getting into who's right and who's wrong and et cetera. I don't want to get the debate on the Middle East. You have other speakers to do that. But a feeling that Palestinians, whether the feeling is right or wrong, again, I'm ducking that, have been not given their due, have not been given the degree of world sympathy and attention that they should. Now, I think part of the problem, of course, is we Jews suffered a horrendous tragedy in the lifetime of many people that we know. Many of your congregants, fewer than just a few years ago, but you still have survivors of the Holocaust. You have Americans who were alive during the Holocaust. We have veterans of World War II. 1 out of every 3 Jews was murdered. 1, 2, 3 murdered. 1, 2, 3 murdered. 1 out of every 3 Jews was murdered during those years. But on some level, we recovered. We didn't recover in the numbers, but we've recovered, we've rebuilt. We Jews are good at that. We've gone through a lot of traumas when we've had to recover. And people seem to think, well, you had the Holocaust or you suffered that tragedy, but you're doing well now, so let's set it aside. And I think there's a certain, there's overt anti-Semitism. There's a person who, very few people will say I'm an anti-Semite, but the people who are overtly anti-Semitic, but there's also what I call the anti-Semitism in the weeds, the anti-Semitism that has sort of worked itself into general perceptions. The student who comes to me one day, very distressed, she's in a suite with 3 other women or 4 other women, and they've been together. They chose after their freshman year to live together. So these are girls, women who really like each other and support each other, have each other's backs. And she said to me, I'm the only one in the suite who's Jewish, and I'm the only one in the suite who's on work study, meaning she's on scholarship. She has special work study programs to help her, earn some money while she's at school. She said, we were sitting around discussing what we were going to be doing during winter break. And someone said, oh, are you going skiing with your family? She said, my family hasn't gone on a vacation since my siblings started to go to college. And I don't know if they'll ever go on a vacation again because they're recovering from the debts they owe. She said, but this woman just assumed that, it's the assumption, you're Jewish, you must be rich. You're Jewish, you must be more powerful. And the assumption that we do well, their sympathy when there was Pittsburgh Now, I remember many years ago, and I don't buy this, but Cynthia Ozick has a way of writing very provocative things. I think she wrote an article in commentary, "The whole world wants the Jews dead," or something. Do you
That's
remember that
Esquire.
article?
It was in Esquire,
Esquire,
1976.
Ah, my God. You could be my bibliographic assistant if this synagogue thing doesn't work out for you. I need a bibliographic assistant.
I'm coming.
Okay. I don't think the whole world wants the Jews dead, but we get sympathy when we suffer. But when we're not, we're pretty resilient. Thank God for that. But so none of those things play into seeing the Jew as a potential victim of hatred.
Again, we planned on this conversation months and months ago, but in the last 3 weeks or so, the conversation has turned. So let's take up that directly now. Give us a definition and a rule for distinguishing between three phenomena: criticism of Israel's government and its policies, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism.
Okay, the first one is easy. You want to hear criticism of Israeli policies? Well, we're about to get it. Israel's about to get a new government, but go to a cafe in Tel Aviv, in Ra'anana, Baca. You'll hear criticism of Israeli policies. Criticisms of a country's policies is not hatred of that country. There were many people, certainly many people on this session tonight who up until, I don't know, November 10th, or certainly January 20th, were very critical of American policies. They weren't hostile to it. They weren't anti-American. They were that's what a democracy is. You're critical of the policies of the group you don't support that very often happens to be in power. So when someone criticizes policies, even criticizes them virulently, criticizes Israel's policies, to declare them to be anti-Semitic is not only wrong, but it's counterproductive. Because when a person really engages in anti-Semitism, they say, "Oh, you Jews always cry anti-Semitism, whether it's anti-Semitism or not." In terms of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, it gets trickier. Now, some people say blanket, anybody who opposes the existence of the state of Israel is an anti-Semite. So I say to them, well, what about Satmar Hasidim? I'm not even talking about Neturei Karta, but Satmar Hasidim who are opposed to and they say, well, not them. I say, well, either or not. So, but I think someone who says, to my mind, and not everyone agrees with me, but someone who says that the Jewish state has no right to exist, that Jews have no right to a national identity, are ignoring a major facet of Jewish history and Jewish identity. Jews, we're murky when in departments of religion. I'm at Emory, I'm in the religion department and the Jewish studies program. And it gets murky when you study Jews because we're not quite a religion. We're people, how do you define it? You've dealt with this many times, as have many people who are listening. But when people say that Jews don't have a right to a national identity, they're denying a major portion of Jewish history, a major portion of Jewish identity. And Jews have had a connection to the land, and I'm not getting now into the politics of what and who, but have had a connection to that land of Israel for a very long time. So people who would deny that right, I say, if they're not expressing anti-Semitism, they're getting very close to it. I'm careful about it because I think there's shades of difference. An anti-Semite is someone who clearly, there's a template for anti-Semitism is a prejudice. And every prejudice has a template of charges, whether you take Black people, whether you take Latinos, whether you take Muslims. And there's a template of things that are associated with the prejudice against the particular group. And in terms of the anti-Semitic template, I usually cite four things, some of which I've already mentioned. Something to do with money, something to do with finances, something to do with smarts, but not constructive smarts, malicious, nefarious smarts, clever, conniving, something to do with punching above your weight, small in number, but able to control the power behind the throne. And something to do, and this I think comes straight out of Christian theology, and of course has morphed over the years, something with the ability to do with the ability to work behind the scenes, to be the puppeteer and not the puppet. And that is the Jew, that really why I say it has its roots in Christian culture, is that comes from the devil. You know, I think it was Trachtenberg who wrote the book, The Devil and the Jews. And the devil in Christian theology is A, the only entity who can harm God, and B, the devil does his handiwork before you've known you've encountered the devil. The devil is come and gone. And in that fit in traditional Christian theology vis-a-vis Jews and the deicide, the death of Jesus, that fit the Jew. So I think those things are very much part of that template, and they play their role. They play their role. If you're looking for anti-Semitism, you'll find those things there.
Jews respond to anti-Semitism with a variety of different sort of modes. There are some who become despairing and say this is a horrifying thing, and they sort of recoil. Some are fearful. One of the most interesting are those who say we have to fight. We have to go on the offensive. So talk to me for a moment about what does it mean to fight anti-Semitism? How do you fight a conspiracy theory that is immune to facts? How do you fight anti-Semitism?
Well, you said the key word here. That a moment ago I said anti-Semitism is a prejudice like other prejudices, but it's got a certain distinctive characteristics. A, the fact that we have seen it on the right and on the left, as I mentioned earlier. But B, the conspiracy theory. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory, the idea that Jews are behind the scene manipulating, and I've referred that, we've talked about that, which doesn't play out in other hostilities, particularly racial hostilities as they expressed in the Western world and particularly in our country. So fighting it is very hard. Fighting any prejudice is hard. You know, people used to say to me, so every once in a while, I remember a number of years ago, I think it was even shortly after my case, or maybe while I was still on trial in England, someone discovered in a Berlin attic, the office building that was being redone, I think drawings for the gas chambers. I don't remember precisely what they were, but I think that's what they were. And someone called me up and said, Deborah, do you think if we show these to deniers, they'll understand that they really were gas chambers? And I said, you got it all wrong. Deniers, Holocaust deniers, it's a form of anti-Semitism, are not deniers because they missed one piece of information, because they didn't see one document or they didn't see one drawing. For deniers to be right, who would have to be wrong? Survivors, the thousands of documents, the bystanders who lived in the towns and villages near the camps and the killing sites, thousands of historians in every continent in the world who study this, and the perpetrators who say I did it. So it's a ludicrous, it's stupid. So you can't fight stupid, you know, prejudge, prejudice, prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts I made up my mind. It's very hard to fight stupid with information. So that's my long way of saying to you, Ed, though I have spent the major part of my academic year and my personal and private life, you know, and so much of my energies fighting this, that I don't have an easy answer. It's a little bit like whack-a-mole. You hit it one place, it pops up somewhere else. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight it. How do we fight it? I think, first of all, humor is great. Humor is great. Maybe that should be my last answer, but humor is great. Humor is great. Humor is great to show the stupidity. If anti-Semitism weren't so harmful and so potentially dangerous, it would just be ludicrous. It is ludicrous, but we could dismiss this as ludicrous. You know, the anti-Semite says, the Jews are all capitalists. They control everything. The Jews are all communists. The anti-Semite says, Jews get together and they stay together and they're in their little pods or whatever, their little ghettos. The anti-Semite says Jews always want to be in places they're not wanted. They want to get into clubs that don't want them. Well, last time I checked, you can't be a capitalist and a communist. You can't be pushy and trying to get into clubs that don't want you and be cleaving together at the same time. It makes no sense, which is one of the reasons why it is so hard to fight. I think the way to do, one of the ways to do it is to show people its ridiculousness, how ridiculous it is, to show people the harm it causes, and to also know when to hold your fire. And I don't say hold your fire, you know, don't make a fuss, shashtil. I think we're way past the shashtil. And I feel very sorry for Jews who still live in the shashtil kind of world, like don't make a fuss, the joke, talking about jokes of 3 Jews go AWOL during the war and they're brought before the firing squad. And the head of the firing squad says, you have a chance for one last request. And one of them says, I'd like a cigarette. And the other one says, shh, don't make a fuss, you'll make it worse. You're going to be shot. But to hold your fire, because sometimes if we call attention to something, it creates a copycat phenomenon. To know when, I'm not saying if there's an attack or whatever, but to know when and to fight it smartly. To fight it, it's not something just that you disagree with. It's not something that makes you uncomfortable. And we Jews have been often made uncomfortable with, other Jews doing things or things related to Israel or whatever. But it's when it is hatred of Jews and a sense that they are capable of certain wrongs that are horrendous in measure.
I wonder if I could ask you to change for a moment and use your historical mind for a moment and take a step above all of this. What does this rise of anti-Semitism tell us about American culture and American society at this moment in our experience?
Well, it's if it was just the anti-Semitism, it would be bad enough. But in the past 4 or 5, maybe even 12 years, I don't know if it doesn't date to a certain degree from the election of a man of African American descent or a Black man and into the presidency, which disturbed many Americans greatly. I think we to a certain degree we have bought into a certain view of America that we want to embrace, that exists but doesn't go as deeply and as evenly as we would like it to be. There's a lot of America's a very fractious place, and that's come out more. And then, of course, it comes out more when you have politicians, as we had for 4 years up until recently, who play on that, who are, to use the Yiddish term, kochlöffel, a cooking spoon, who stir up the pot. Who themselves may not be anti-Semites, but who use anti-Semitism, who use hatred to divide amongst people. And what we've seen, I'm nervous about American democracy. I mean, this whole group grew, this organization, which has done such an amazing job and has, according to the forwards, crushed the Jewish internet. It's a time of great concern. I live in a state which has had a miracle and a potential disaster. A miracle that an African American man and a Jewish man are our 2 senators. I mean, that's amazing. In fact, when Senator Ossoff was sworn in, he was sworn in on the Bible of the rabbi of the temple which was bombed, during the civil rights era, the temple which was the only place when Martin Luther King came back from getting his Nobel Peace Prize, no hotel in Atlanta would host a dinner in his honor. So the temple held the dinner. And Rabbi Rothstein was a great fighter for this, and it was his Herzchumash that John Ossoff used to be sworn in on. At the same time, we're seeing an attempt to deny people their voting rights. We're seeing an attempt to allow politicians to overturn votes. So it wasn't just the anti-Semitism that has left me concerned about America. It's some of the racism, the division, the white supremacy, which leaves me greatly disturbed. But the fact that we are seeing in America anti-Semitism the way we've seen it, it doesn't, most Jews go on with their lives. But I think many Jews have been somewhat shaken, certainly over the past 4 or 5 years, and certainly over the past 2-3 weeks.
You gave a marvelous TED talk some years ago based on your work on Holocaust denial. And at the end of the talk, you gave a sermon, and I was so proud of that. And you talked about the war on truth, and that at the heart of Holocaust denial is a war on truth. And it occurred to me, I listened to that the other day, and it occurred to me that we're all experiencing this war on truth at the moment. That there really is an attack on what's called, I guess, liberal epistemology, the notion that there are objective facts, not just narratives, that there are realities that we can hold and point to, and we can differ in our values, we can differ in our interpretations, but certain things happen to be true in the world. But that liberal epistemology itself seems to be under attack, again, from both sides. On the one side, alternative facts, and on the other side, this whole notion of it's all narratives, it's all an expression of privilege. What happens to a culture? And again, I'm asking you as a historian, as much as a prognosticator, what happens to a culture that loses touch with the fundamental idea that there is a reality that we share?
Not good things. I think of, but that's my profound historical answer.
Thank you.
Bad things. I think of Weimar Germany, which not only was riddled, with anti-Semitism, it was a democracy, it was Germany's attempt of a democracy, but there was tremendous anti-Semitism, tremendous hostility. There were communism, socialists. It was a ribbon society. But also talking about what you were, more specifically, what you were asking about truth. Though he wasn't the one who originally said it, he did popularize it, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. You can have your own opinions, you can't have your own facts. And when you give someone a fact, they say, well, that's your opinion. I'm sitting in the shadow of the CDC. I live right near the CDC. And you say something that was, that's what they think, and not to speak of the fact that the CDC now once again is populated and led by scientists. But the person telling it to me has no scientific knowledge, but they think, their opinion is equal to a fact. It's a very dangerous thing. It's a very dangerous thing. And I think we have to really recognize that the attack on truth and making truth a negotiable kind of thing is very dangerous. And I'm not saying there are fixed truths that don't change. Science changes. We've watched that with the pandemic. When it first started, scientists knew so much. Now they know much more, and it evolves. But this notion, this populist notion, that I have every right to my facts, to make up my own facts, as you do. And the other part of the populist notion, this goes back to an earlier question of yours, if you win, I lose, that it's a zero-sum game. One of the things, and I'm going to jump in here, you haven't really asked this, but I want to make sure to get it in. One of the things that worries me greatly about the current fight against prejudice in America, including anti-Semitism. I've talked a lot, I'm sure some of your listeners know Eric Ward and his work out of Oregon, out of Portland. Eric is a very fine observer of American life, happens to be a Black man he sees the confluence of racism and anti-Semitism, of hatred of people of color and anti-Semitism. But so often I hear people saying, well, enough about anti-Semitism, now is the time to talk about racism. Enough about anti-Semitism, we're talking now about anti-Asian hatred. They're all part and parcel of the same thing. The minute you start attacking one group, you're attacking the other groups. It's not separate and apart. And amongst some people, sadly, there's the feeling that if we talk about racism and we talk about the confluence between racism and anti-Semitism, particularly on the right, which we've seen Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, San Diego, the Mother Emanuel, Dylan Roof at Mother Emanuel Church, who was motivated by that same ideology, that they're linked together, that you can't fight one without the other. If I could have my druthers, of course, if I could have my druthers, I'd want to wake up tomorrow morning and be irrelevant, and not be. I got a note today from a mother in London whose child had experienced anti-Semitism. She knows my Coast connections. I don't know her, but she just found my email and wrote to me, and it's a difficult situation. I would love not to be getting those kind of messages. I appreciate the fact that I can make a difference. I'm very grateful for that, or at least try to help. I don't know if I can make a difference, but for people to recognize that the fight against hatred isn't, well, now I'm against this group, and now I'm against, or I'm for this group, and you can't expect me to worry about the other group. But they're tied together. They're not separate and apart. Jews present differently than many other minority groups that have been objects of prejudice, certainly other racial minorities in America. We look, as I said earlier, we look like we're doing just fine. But we know, and I hate making glib Holocaust analogies. This is not, I hope it's not glib, and it's not directly a Holocaust analogy, but I've read enough memoirs of Jews in Weimar Germany and Jews in the early periods of the Third Reich who said, "Oh, this will pass. It's not so bad." And they were sitting very pretty, Yoshvim Levetach, we say in Hebrew. They were sitting secure. I'm not saying that that's the same, because there's something very different today too. Even as I draw that analogy, let me be my own critic. Today, we have governments which speak out against this. We have governments which condemn it. We have presidents who condemn it. We have prime ministers who condemn it. Chancellor Merkel condemning it. Wherever it might be, you have leaders. The government, no government has adopted it as its own yet.
Well, we have some questions from members of the audience. Let me sort of put a few of them together so we can get to them. Alan wants to know, Alan and both Jean want to know about Christian evangelicals and their support for Israel. What's going to happen now that Netanyahu is out of office? I understand there's one particular evangelical leader who is quite disturbed by that. Is the Christian evangelical community, where has it come down with these attacks on Jews?
Well, it's a complicated factor, a complicated situation. The Christian evangelical community has been tremendous supporters of the Netanyahu government. Of course, tremendous supporters of Israel, and that's been the past 12 years that we've had a Netanyahu government, or Israel has had a Netanyahu government. One preacher who I don't know how many followers he really has, did, when he was criticizing the new coalition, or potentially the new government, engaged in some overt anti-Semitism. It was very frightening and interesting, revealing to see the way he fell right back into that. I'm sometimes reminded of the saying, I forget the exact source. I think it's a Rashi commentary. Lomi duvshech velomi ukshech. It said to the honeybee, "I don't want your honey and I don't want your sting. Just leave me alone. Don't love me too much because I'm a Jew, and don't hate me because I'm a Jew. Just treat me as a normal person. Treat me as as you would anybody else." The evangelical community has been very strong supporters of Israel, and in many cases they've been pretty lonely in that voice of support. But when it gets tied to a particular political position, I get a little wary of it.
Or personage, or one personality.
Certainly of a persona. Tying it to one persona, in any case, when you tie things to one persona, you're very often on the slippery slope downwards.
Well, let's focus on that for just a moment, because that's both a phenomenon about Israel and about America. When a large percentage of the populace sees one persona, regardless of policy, because it's irrelevant. Policy seems to be irrelevant. It's the persona that they are attached to. What does that say about democracy?
It says that democracy is in danger. Democracy is in danger. The former president, when he was accepting the Republican nomination in, I guess, 2016, at the convention, talked about the problems facing America, and many of them were genuine problems. And then he said a sentence which sent chills up my spine. I alone can face it. The minute you think that any politician alone can fix it, I alone can fix it. The minute you think that any politician on the left or on the right, whoops, sorry about that, I'm getting a little carried away here, on the left or on the right can fix something, then you're veering away from democracy. Democracy means respecting difference. That means there are going to be laws passed which I don't like, or aspects of laws which I don't like. But when it becomes the zero-sum game, when it becomes you are not only wrong, but you're evil, then we're in very difficult straits. And when you have leaders, and it wasn't just in this country, it was in other countries as well, when you have leaders who vilify, not criticize, but vilify their opponents, it's very dangerous. And the reason that so often, not always, but so often backs into anti-Semitism, is because in that vilification is often a portrayal of a group that's all powerful, that's all ability to control things. And that very often is the Jew. Yair Rosenberg, who's a very, very astute observer of the Jewish scene, writes in Tablet a lot, had an article about a month ago wondering why conspiracy theorists, even about the vaccines, but other things as well, often come to the Jew, even if they're not anti-Semites. That the anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists will come to the Jew is, no surprise. But why the others will? Because when you create a conspiracy theory, and this goes back to something you asked about very early in our conversation, when you create a conspiracy theory, you need a mover and an all-powerful mover, shaker behind the scenes, the puppeteer, and the Jew fits into that so well. So when there is this vilification, when there are these conspiracy theories are never good for Jews.
So, and on the other side of the political spectrum, Doug asks about the squad, about AOC, about those members of Congress as well. We could ask about Senator Sanders and a large movement on the left, as it were, that is pushing back on American support for Israel, let's put it that way, under the banner of social justice. And how concerned should we be about that?
I am concerned about that. If I wasn't concerned about that, then I would be, when I say only criticize the other side of the transom, I would be doing exactly that. I am concerned about that. I'm also concerned about that because some of those people, not all of them, but some of those people have made statements and said things which, if not overtly anti-Semitic, come pretty close up against it. Representative Omar has said things in the past, and then she apologizes and then she says a similar thing, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just their questioning of certain support for Israel, that often bothers me as well. And but the depiction of Israel as the sole source of evil in the Middle East, the depiction of Israel as the sole wrongdoer. And as I say, you can criticize policies, but when you only see one group, they're the only ones responsible. If only they had, I think you're not doing a very fair, evaluation of the situation. And there's some people, who, when they talk about contemporary anti-Semitism, well, it was Netanyahu's policies. They created anti-Semitism. Sometimes someone asks me, what about Jeffrey Epstein? Did he create it? Did he, or Madoff or whatever it is? It's a ridiculous kind of premise because first of all, anti-Semitism, as I said, is a prejudice. It prejudge. It's a ludicrous kind of concept. Number one. Number two, if you're going to say it's okay to attack a Jew on 47th Street and 7th Avenue in Manhattan, or a Jew on the Finchley Road in Golders Green in London, because you disagree with the policies of the actions of the state of Israel, that makes no sense. That's anti-Semitism. It will be the same way, and this is it's a loose analogy, but the same way if let's say you were mugged or hurt, or there was an incident, a shooting incident, and the shooter happened to be African American, and you say, you see, you always talking to me about Black Lives Matter. You're talking to me about George Floyd. Look what happens over there. Well, that's racism. Because the shooter happens to be a Black man, you say, oh, Black Lives Matter is a phony issue. Because the shooter happens to be a Black man, you say, George Floyd, it's a phony issue. Because you disagree with the policy of the state of Israel, it's okay to go and beat up a Jew in front of a sushi restaurant on Pico Boulevard. I think it was on Pico Boulevard. Or it's okay to beat up a Jew on 47th Street or in London, or to ride through Jewish neighborhoods saying, F the Jews and kill their women. I love that. I hated it, but of course, the women are not Jews; we're theirs. What kind of state would those people create? But you can disagree. It would be like saying, "Oh, there's a person over there, maybe an American of Chinese heritage." And I think what China's doing to the Uyghurs, to the Chinese Muslims, is terrible. I'm going to go beat them up. You'd say that's racism in the extreme. So to connect the two is anti-Semitism.
We have just a moment or two left, and I want to give you a chance for a closing statement. But several people who are listening asked me to ask you to reflect for a moment. It's been how many years since your trial with David?
20 years. 20 years.
So
20 years.
As you reflect back on it, how did that change your life? What did you learn? What should we learn from that?
Well,
it's a great movie. A great movie, Denial. It's a great movie. You can get it on Netflix.
Thank you. Great screenwriter David Hare, great director Mick Jackson, living in your backyard, and great actors, including especially Rachel Weisz. What did I learn from that? I learned that there's certain fights you can't turn away from. There were people who said to me, "Don't fight, Deborah." There were people who said to me, "You're wasting your time. Do research, do your work, do your creative research." There's certain fights you can turn away from, but there's certain fights you cannot turn away from. That was one thing I learned. The other thing I learned is that I had community support, not just in terms of a defense fund, but people rallying to my side. Every day I came to that courtroom, there were people there. My lawyers took to asking me, first they used to say to me, what cities are here? Then they took what continents. There were people there from the Middle East. There were people there from Australia who flew in. I say to them, how come you're in London? How come I'm in London? I came to be with you. Mm-hmm. You need a community. You need a community around you. And certainly that. And then I learned, we all thought, I think we did accomplish something in that fight. I talk about two kinds of denial: hardcore denial and softcore denial. Hardcore denial is what I fought in court, that there were no gas chambers, the Nazis didn't want to kill the Jews. Anybody who says that today is generally laughed, they're seen as ludicrous. Softcore denial is much, to use a highfalutin academic term, it's much squishier. It's harder to fight. It's kind of, we're hearing about the Holocaust again about the Holocaust, suggesting it's not important, or false analogies to the Holocaust. That's quite prevalent, but the hardcore stuff, I think we did fight. We did manage to, not alone, many, but that was part of the victory in that regard. I mean, the guy on Capitol Hill during the insurrection was wearing the Camp Auschwitz t-shirt, which on the back, what's it on the back? Staff. He was universally seen as a despicable character. What have I learned? I've learned that sometimes you gotta fight. It was hard, it was scary. And I was very lucky to have great people around me to help me make that fight.
Thank you. I want to remind our listeners before we conclude that next week, Jews United for Democracy and Justice, JUDJ, which can always use your support to put these programs forward. Next week, we'll be having Michael Steele, former chairman of the National Republican Party, interviewed with Bill Kristol, the journalist, and they'll be talking about the future of the GOP. And the following week, a session on humor, satire, and politics. Pick two. But enjoy that. Deborah, a closing, first of all, thank you for your insights, and a closing statement, a closing word,
Well,
a little bit of inspiration so we can go out.
A little chizuk, a little strengthening.
A little chizuk.
Right. Well, what I want to say is that this fight of anti-Semitism goes on. But if you think back on it, a few years ago, I was in Bath. I was on my way to the book aficionado, book festival aficionados will know the Hay on Wye festival, biggest book festival in the world. And I was being interviewed. And while I was in Bath, I went to see the Roman baths, which were quite beautiful. They're like an ancient spa, the first rates, hot rooms, steam rooms, cold pools, hot pools. And I said, gee, if I were there, this is a team I would want to be part of. And then I came to the temple and I said, well, this was a religious thing. And I thought about it and I thought, there's no logical reason for Jews to be here. As a historian, you told me a couple of times, put on my historian's hat. There's no logical reason for Jews to have survived. But Mir Zayin and Da, we're here. We have survived. We thrive. And I don't want to be the one to break the chain. But I also don't want to be the one to ever say, because of anti-Semitism, I remain strong in my Jewish identity. I had a student once come to me, suddenly he was wearing a kippah. I'd been my student for 4 years. And he came into the office and I wanted to say, what's up with the headgear? But I thought that wasn't a professional thing to do. So before he left, he said, you notice I'm wearing a kippah? I said, oh yeah, what's that about? He said, there's been an outbreak of anti-Semitism. I want to stand strong against it. And I smiled, but inside my heart was breaking. Because if he wants to wear a kippah, if he wants to be strong in his, let him do it because of a pull, not a push. I have a little neighbor. She's now 8. She and I are very close friends. When she was about 4, I was walking into synagogue with her mother, and there was a guard in front of the synagogue, just at that point, a lonely guard. And her mother said, "Thank the police officer for keeping us safe." And the little girl looked at her mother totally confused, because shul is her happy place. Synagogues are a happy place. She gets to run around with no supervision, to go to groups where they sing and they eat, get snacks, and to have a good time. And here her mother was saying, thank the guard for keeping us safe. She thanked him, but she didn't understand it. Fast forward a couple of years, it was about a year after Pittsburgh. She saw me walking to synagogue, and she said, I'm going to walk with Deborah. And we walked in, and as we walked in, now we have 2 guards and police cars and all sorts of stuff, nothing strange to you. And I was about to sort of nudge her to say, thank the police officers, but she did it without my saying anything. She turned to the police officers and said, thank you for taking care of us. Now, she had figured out by age 6 or 7 that we needed taking care of. Well, my prayer for that little friend of mine, and my prayer for the kids in your congregation, the children, grandchildren, anyone, is that while we may need protection, that never becomes the reason for our being Jewish. It's the afal pi, it's the despite the efforts of the world to so often hurt us, to denigrate us. We remain proud in who we are because of the joys, not the oys, the pulls, not the pushes. We've given so much to the world. We have such a rich and variegated and multifaceted heritage. Let that never, never, never be overshadowed by the hostility against us.
Professor Lipstadt, thank you so very much for your beautiful.
Thank you, Rabbi Feinstein.
Deep insight. It's wonderful to be together. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us, and please join us for future programs of JUDJ. Thanks so much.